Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. We've got lots of people online, which is great. Thank you for joining us for this masterclass for Hong Kong. First up, we'll have Catherine from Asialink. Then we'll have a short break, hand over to Najib from Export Connect, and then Owen from Australian Organic will speak. I'm sure Catherine and Najib will be taking questions throughout the morning. Pop them in the chat box if you have any questions, and enjoy the day. It'll be great content, I'm sure, and we'll see you all at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning. And in terms of the way we're going to run the session, we've got 1 hour together to really give a little bit of context in terms of Hong Kong and why it might be interesting for you as an export market. To give a little bit of a sense too of typically what it might be like to work in a Hong Kong context before we jump into the details with Najib then really starting to run into some of the export components and requirements, and finally Owen working through the regulations. So many of you are new to me, so just a quick hi. I'm Catherine Mudford from Asialink Business. Before we begin formally, I really wanted to just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're present today and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending this online session with us today. Some of you may not know Asialink Group, so I wondered whether it might be useful just to give a quick overview of our work at Asialink. So we're Australia's leading centre for engagement with Asia. We are uniquely Australian, and we work through 4 pillars which really help build that Australia-Asia connection. And we do that through diplomacy, programs in diplomacy, programs in education, programs in art. And then we particularly also do that through a focus on, through Asialink Business, which is Australia's national centre for Asia capability, building the workforce capability of Australians to navigate that really fast changing Asia context. And so super delighted that we get the chance to spend some time with you all today to build up that muscle and that confidence, I guess, in terms of how you might navigate and work more closely with Asian markets. So the hour that we have together is really designed to do three things. To give an overview of Hong Kong in terms of sort of where has Hong Kong as a market come from, and what does that mean in terms of how Hong Kong operates. Then we're really going to spend a bit of time thinking about some frameworks that might help you navigate culture as you work in Hong Kong and other markets outside of Australia, and some insights into some of what drives Hong Kongese and how that might help you in terms of setting up successfully if Hong Kong is a market that you decide to expand or do more work in. Before we go there though, I wonder if we could just get a bit of a sense from the group of the experience that you have had already in terms of living, working or connecting with Hong Kong. Thanks, Raj. So yeah, just a little bit of a show of hands, as we say. But in Zoom land, use of the poll. So have you lived and worked in Hong Kong or worked with partners in Hong Kong already? Perhaps you could just give us a yes or a no in a sense of what your experience is. I'd love to get a sense of that for us across the group. So if you're able to, you can just pop into that poll. Select yes if you've lived or worked with partners based in Hong Kong already. And if you haven't done that yet, just select no. And Raj is the mystery man who's keeping that poll running for me. And so yeah, 1/4 of you have said that you've got experience, either lived or worked or working with partners, but 3/4 of you are saying that Hong Kong is a new market for you. I wonder if one of the folks who'd said that Hong Kong is somewhere that they've got experience with would just be willing just to have a quick word to the group in terms of the connection that you have had and the experience that you have had so far? I know this is always the part where you're like, oh gosh, do I have to speak up? It would be wonderful if one of those folks that selected that would like to share a little bit. Yeah. All right, I'm going to take that as no one's quite ready, and I certainly don't want to call out folks. But if what I warmly invite you to do is, if during the session together you're one of those folks who's had some experience, you might be living in Hong Kong right now, you might have spent time working with partners, please do speak up, add your insight and expertise to the dialogue too, because that will be really helpful for the group. We just wanted to play a really short video for you. And as you get ready to watch this video, I'd love you just to take a notice of what it is that you do notice. Anything that comes up in terms of what stands out for you in terms of the messaging of the video. Let's take it away, Shahira. For those of you who have access to the chat, I'd love just to get a couple of words. So as you watch that video, what strikes you? What things do you notice, or what comes up for you as you watch that video? Any of the words that you noticed as you listened, and the words that were flashing up, or the images, things that you expected or things that were unfamiliar? Any takeaways as you kind of think about that video? Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Uncertainty facing a dynamic market. Cozy, thanks. Yeah, the new Hong Kong is a modern city. Some really interesting thinking behind that video, isn't it? So, you know, the words that we saw popping up at the very beginning of that video, conflict, division, but Hong Kong is still strong. So those of you who've been watching the media over the last 2 years particularly, but really as far back as sort of 2014, will have seen, you know, a lot in the press. You will have seen the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, as we've seen this kind of concept of one country, two systems coming under pressure. And I thought it's worthwhile just, and those beginning shots of the video were shots taken, you know, during the 2019 pro-democracy protests. And I thought it might be worthwhile just kind of reflecting for a minute what's been happening in Hong Kong over the recent while, and what implication, if any, that might have in terms of how Hong Kongese are thinking, what that might mean as you start to connect, and what that might mean in terms of the opportunities for you to do business and the way you might think about doing business given the Hong Kongese psyche right now. So if we step back to the beginning of time, as many of you will know, you know, back in the 1840s, as a result of the Opium Wars, Britain was given a lease of land around, first of all, Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, the new territories, those three land masses that made up Hong Kong. And so China signed over Hong Kong to Britain for a period of time, with the intention that Hong Kong would always be handed back to China in 1997. So way back in 1984, in fact, at that point in time, 15 years before that handover, there was a signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which declared this term that you often hear, one country, two systems. So yes, we're one country, China and our territories, but we're comfortable to have two systems. And that system is that we're enshrining in our basic law that democracy, as Hong Kong has known it, will continue. And in addition, that there'll be this promise of universal suffrage in terms of election of the Hong Kong chief executive in 2017. So that's the context. In 1997, we saw that handover. And when I arrived in Hong Kong to work for the first time in 1999, the handover had already happened and been really smooth. What we saw briefly, starting to pop up from around 2012 onwards, was the sense of we are expecting as Hong Kongese that there'll be this opportunity to directly elect our Hong Kong chief executive. What we've seen in the press for the last 5 years, right through until March last month, is this tussle in many ways between Hong Kongese and Beijing. With Beijing's point of view being quite strong, is that actually what we're looking for is a process which will make sure that we can still have long-term stability and prosperity in Hong Kong. And we feel that that won't be through Hong Kongese directly electing a chief executive. And that's really what those protests have been about. In addition, we've seen additional muscle from China over the last, 2 years particularly. And the pro-democracy movement did gain a lot of traction. However, as of March, we've seen the Beijing push, and we see really a move away from language that refers to one country, two systems. There's much more focus on a united China and its territories, and much more focus on how could we have patriots, those who are really connected to the overall Chinese philosophy, coming closer together. The video that you saw was really designed to help us go, politics is one thing. However, underneath all of that, Hong Kong always has been and always will be a thriving economic centre, and that we can look at these two things separately. So I wanted to give you that context. I know for some of you, you will have been watching the news, and those will be things that are, top of mind. But for others of us that perhaps haven't been watching the news or seeing that in the same way, It's just useful to get that sense of where is Hong Kong right now. The party line is, as we've just seen, let's separate out the politics from the economics. We've got this amazing, thriving economic hub here. It is a gateway to China and a gateway to the rest of Asia. How will we continue to harness all of the strength that we've got? The other thing, of course, that it's worth noting in terms of kind of impact on Hong Kong has been the response to COVID and the way Hong Kong's been able to recover from that. The response to COVID was pretty strong compared to other parts of the world in terms of being able to contain the virus, being able to continue to operate. But the economic damage has been quite significant. And some of the reasons for that, you know, obviously around the world we've seen that. But some of the reasons for that is a lot of Hong Kong's economy is dependent on Chinese tourists, particularly for retail, coming in. So as those borders closed down, you had none of that through traffic coming into Hong Kong, and you saw a real strong impact in terms of particularly retail. And particularly in terms of the kinds of products that Australian organisations might be producing. So there typically is a strong demand for traditional Australian exports to Hong Kong, premium food and beverages, consumer products, whether that's health, nutraceuticals, beauty products. Those are all things which do have strong demand in Hong Kong, but also particularly from those Chinese visitors who will come across the border into Hong Kong to shop. So COVID has had a negative impact in terms of the economy. It's had a positive impact in terms of closing down those protests. So one of the reasons that we no longer saw those 2019 pro-democracy protests is because of COVID, there was the ability to close down Hong Kong in the sense of no protests about anything because everybody's in lockdown. In terms of what you might be very interested in, of course, is I've just said that there's a strong demand for traditional Australian products, but there's an increasing interest too in organic products. And so although we've seen in the most recent data, the organic market in Hong Kong has fallen, that's simply in line with what we've seen in terms of drop in retail overall. It's really interesting to notice the data on the right-hand side of the slide, which is the willingness of consumers in Hong Kong to spend on organic food products. So, you know, around 61% of consumers have reported that they're willing to spend up to a quarter more for organic food products. It's really significant in terms of the potential size of that market. And there's a few different reasons for that. It's really sort of worth noting in terms of what's at play for Hong Kongese as they think about the kind of products that they want to buy and the interest. One of the real concerns for many Hong Kongese certainly is the origin and the ingredients of their food products. You know, increasingly there's a worry around where products come from, how they've been processed, how they're being produced. And that's particularly because of that close proximity to China and some of what Hong Kongese will have seen and experienced in terms of what they are able to access and what they have had. Perception of Australian products is that Australian products are safe. Our clean and green brand really resonates in terms of what you see in Hong Kong. There's a high sense of trust in the quality of the products, our products overall, but particularly an interest in our organic products, and the sense of trustworthiness. So there's a couple of things that come together or converge beautifully for us in terms of Australian producers. One is this increasing demand and willingness to pay for organic products. you will see organic products side by side on the shelf in retail spaces like mainstream supermarkets like Welcome and Park and Sage. And at the same time, a belief that Australian products really are filling the gap that consumers are looking for when they're looking at the fact that we want organic because we want to be able to trust what we've got. We want to trust that it's chemical free. We want to trust that it has health benefits. It's good for me and good for my family. So when it comes to opportunities for you and your businesses, when you think about Hong Kong, so if that's the context, we've got this opportunity, I guess, in terms of a demand for the goods and particularly organic products that we're producing. A little bit about the context of Hong Kong itself. It's multicultural. People are fluent in English. So given the time under sort of British rule and that period of time, you've got an infrastructure that's built around the understanding of English language, but also beautifully Chinese language too and Chinese culture. So we often talk about Hong Kong as a geographical gateway. It sits right there as a gateway into China and also into the rest of the region. So its location is perfect, but beyond its location, it's also this cultural gateway that gives an opportunity to expand into the market. Maybe just a snapshot of things that you might know or might not around Hong Kong. So each year, the World Economic Forum takes a look at sort of what we would call the global competitiveness of different countries around the globe. In 2019, Hong Kong came in at number 3, as in the 3rd most globally competitive, behind Singapore and the US. And the real strengths of Hong Kong as a market are certainly its positioning as a global financial hub. So you'll see a couple of those number ones there are, Hong Kong as being number 1 around the globe for investor protection, number 1 around the globe for affordability of financial services. And for you all, number 1 in terms of its custom procedures. So a really strong sense of ease of doing business, competitive in terms of the way it's set up to enable trade and to enable economic growth. A few things that we touched on already, just in terms of the location. So we've got this beautiful spot right at the sort of the bottom of China mainland. We've got Hong Kong, and it's really a springboard into China, a gateway into China itself, but also into North Asia, and a sort of a 5 or 6 hour flight across the Asia region. We'll talk a little bit too about kind of some of the special economic zones that have been built up around Hong Kong and which Hong Kong has access to and is quite a significant part of because of the access that it gives you in terms of using Hong Kong not just for domestic consumption, but also as this gateway into those other economic zones as well. And then if we just go back to a little bit of that history in terms of why else does Hong Kong stand out? Under that British rule, one of the things that Hong Kong did inherit, which is very helpful, is a really clean and efficient government system. The rule of law is well established. There's low to no tax in a lot of elements, and we've got this wonderful free trade hub. And so, in fact, with the exception of spirits and some other tobacco, Hong Kong is a free trade port. So it's a wonderful place financially to set up. The other advantage that Hong Kong has is as this real hub for transport and logistics. So in addition to being sort of geographically strategic in terms of its location, Hong Kong has managed to establish itself as this real leading transport and logistics hub. It's this highly efficient, highly effective gateway to China, which makes it a good place to do business. The Hong Kong International Airport is ranked as the world's busiest cargo airport and has been for the last 10 years. The Port of Hong Kong is really seen as sort of this thriving maritime hub, so the ability to freight cargo by port. Hong Kong's the world's 8th busiest container port. And with that connection of sort of air and maritime, what you see is Hong Kong really is this very globally connected hub. So rated the 2nd most connected in the world. And leveraging its real strength in technology to continue to kind of evolve those hubs. So beyond just this really wonderful center of, you know, in and out flights, in and out shipping, a focus on using new smart logistics to really sort of automate a lot of those logistical hubs already. So we're seeing the Hong Kong International Airport predicted for 2023, there'll be large scale robotics, automation, temperature controlled solutions. So this ongoing investment in ensuring that transportation and logistics is really leading up in leading edge. I thought it might be useful. How many of you have heard speak of the Greater Bay Area? Maybe just use the chat for those of you who've heard of the Greater Bay Area. A yes or a no, not yet. Thanks, Tanya, yes. Others? Yeah, thanks, Cozy, no. Others of you reading about the Greater Bay Area? Yeah. Well, the Greater Bay Area, the concept was only launched in 2017. So for those of you who haven't heard of it yet, it's just starting, I guess, for us here in Australia to start to think about it. But what you can see in front of you is a map of Hong Kong fitting into mainland China. And the circles that you're looking at are something that we're calling the Greater Bay Area. So around the Pearl River Delta, we've got 2 territories or special administrative regions, Hong Kong on the right-hand side and Macau on the left. And then within southern China, we've got an additional 9 cities, which are being pulled together into sort of really a special economic zone, which is designed to really be an opportunity to get scale through connecting different cities together. And it's really been a part of China's overall sort of signature strategy, this journey of economic reform by fostering sort of new business opportunities by bringing together city clusters. And that city cluster then enables there to be some economic strength, some building of core capability across the cluster, designed to be in parallel with other sort of Bay areas. So if we think about sort of New York and Greater Tokyo, San Francisco, this is the China answer, I guess, to those economic zones. In terms of why that might be interesting for you to know, is this Greater Bay Area, the Guangdong, 9 cities, Hong Kong and Macau, has a combined population of 70 million. And Hong Kong is going to play a really important role in terms of the development of the Greater Bay Area. Hong Kong obviously right now is seen as the most open and the most international in that sort of special economic zone, with its international transportation, the finance hub, the aviation hub. The intention is that this Greater Bay Area becomes China's version of the Silicon Valley. So there's also huge investment in innovation and technology, and the hope that this Greater Bay hub will then be a gateway also to new paths for development. What it provides, in addition to that sort of massive consumers, so 72 million consumers. But there's a real backing, both by Chinese government, but also by financial, the financial centre and other players around the Greater Bay Area to really invest in that. And invest in products, invest in opportunities that might be very useful for you as you think about where might we innovate, what other new consumers might we have access to, and how can that interregional trade actually be, how can we use the fact that that's set up in that way to give us greater access than we might have if we were just in one. So that was really designed to be just a bit of a quick context in terms of what has happened in Hong Kong over the last while. There has been political unrest, which you will have read about. There is a strong focus, though, on really driving through that economic hub centre, all of the strengths that Hong Kong has built up over the last 150 years. And so at this point in time, one of the things you might want to be thinking about is how can you as an Australian organisation navigate that with, in the way that's most impactful for you. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time just introducing a couple of frameworks that might help in doing that. Some of us have, I had the chance to work with a few of you earlier on our Singapore session. But for the Hong Kong session, I do want to introduce a couple of similar frameworks. And the first framework that many sessions like this find useful to use is the iceberg. And the reason an iceberg is great to use in a session like this is because it tells so much with one quick image. We've got what we see above the surface, which is very little. And we've got a whole bundle of things which happen below the surface. And, and in Titanic style, if we're not watching out for what's going on below the surface, that's where the danger happens. That's where the impact happens, where things can unravel. And so when we think about culture, typically we'd say about 10% of culture is what we see above the surface. The things that people say and do, what we hear, what we see. But the drivers in terms of the why of that, we don't see as easily. It really sits below the surface. And it's the why of what we see that's important for us to understand as you start to think about how might I operate in Hong Kong? Is this a market that would be useful for me? Do I have the capability to navigate some of that complexity? Maybe before we jump into Hong Kong and just kind of get thinking about that iceberg, I would love us just to say, let's look at ourselves for a minute. So for somebody who came into Australia for the first time, what might be some of the things that they notice above the surface? So you've got tourists or other travellers, business travellers coming into Australia for the first time. What might be some of those things that folks notice about us as Australians when they first connect with us? Chat, as many things as come to mind would be wonderful to have in that chat. Things that come to mind. So casual friendliness, Tanya, yeah, absolutely. So people notice that, we really go out of our way to be friendly with most people that we meet in a very informal way. I love that. What else might people notice about Australian culture? Yeah, very relaxed. And our communication can be pretty direct. Yeah. So if we thought about those things, and if I was going to visualize it, above the line, that 10% above the waterline of what people will see is a real casual friendliness. And that might also be what we wear. That might be the casual barbecue that we invite folks to. So they'll see casual clothing, they'll see the barbecue. We see that the drivers of why is that important to us to be seen to be relaxed, that casual friendliness, is driven by a sense of egalitarianism. You know, for new Australians, we had come or arrived here in Australia for different reasons, from very many different backgrounds, and there was a sense of being able to start afresh, the sense of actually it's important that history and status and where we've come from isn't highlighted. What we really want to focus on is the fact that we're equal here in this new nation that we've come to. I draw that out because I think it's really helpful to think about why we do what we do, so that as we start to look at Hong Kong, doing business there, spending time working in Hong Kong, how that might be similar or different, and how that might affect the kind of conversations you have, the kind of meetings you set up, and the way you might get ready for those meetings and those connections. So just really simply, that 90% below the line is driven by what we would call deep culture, the things we don't often even think of because they're so ingrained in terms of the way we think and the way we act. But it's really driven by our values and assumptions, our beliefs, and the rules, those informal rules that have just become, you know, the way we do things around here. But they do drive the way we approach relationships, the way we approach decision-making, problem-solving. It certainly drives what we believe is right in terms of leadership, what we think is appropriate in terms of how we communicate, what we disclose and what we don't. And in a few minutes, we're just going to share a model that might be quite helpful for you in terms of thinking how Australia and Hong Kong are similar or different in terms of these different regards. Because the thing that's really helpful as you think about your business and where you might expand and where you might export to is there are different rules, of course, for different countries and markets. You already know that. You're probably not going to be able to learn the rules for all of those. And that's certainly not our intention at Asialink Business to do that. But what we would like to offer you is a framework that helps you navigate those a bit more simply. And so the framework that we use is something that we talk about as being culturally intelligent. So if IQ is our intellectual quotient, you know, how smart we are, and EQ is our emotional quotient, how connected we are and how capable we are in terms of interpersonal relationships. CQ is our cultural intelligence. And so that's our ability to function effectively in culturally diverse situations. And there's three things that help us do that. Certainly first is the knowledge of the culture. So understanding, you know, in Australia that we like to be laid back. We use humour as a way of deflecting conflict. And it's important for us that we're seen as equal and equally able to contribute. So understanding the knowledge of a culture. The second piece of that equation in terms of being culturally intelligent is just being able to go, so what am I seeing? So really being mindful. If we can't know every small piece, we can certainly be observing and watching and noticing what happens in certain situations. And that's a really important and useful skill to build. And the third part really of being culturally intelligent is then making some decisions. So if I notice that that's the way things are done here, what choices do I have in terms of how do I decide to respond? And you might decide to notice, but choose to do things in a way that's appropriate for your own culture. You might notice and choose to adapt, or you might notice and choose to find almost a third way in terms of how you might work with folks from different contexts and cultures. And so we offer that framework just to say, look, if you can do those few things, what's going on? So what does that mean in terms of how do I understand that? And what am I going to do now as a result of having seen that? Just sort of quick, easy 3 steps that we would encourage you to think about as we jump now into looking a little bit more deeply at the Hong Kong mindset. So the things we've heard already won't be a surprise. So we've got this sense of Hong Kong really is this contemporary culture. You see the pictures of, skyscrapers. We know that it's a global financial hub. It's recognized as this global sort of logistics and transportation hub. And a lot of what you see then is this really interesting mix of this very contemporary, fast-moving, fast-paced city, which sits, right at the bottom of China. So this really strong sort of influence of East meets West in terms of shaping this quite unique culture. It's worth thinking ethnically and culturally, no surprises, that Hong Kong is predominantly of Chinese descent. So 90% of Hong Kongese have come into Hong Kong from China. And China itself is hugely diverse and complex. So the part of China that most folks have come into Hong Kong from is the southern part, so Cantonese ethnicity. Through immigration, through the fact that it is a vibrant trading hub, there are also a number of other ethnic groups, but much, much smaller. So British, Indian, Vietnamese, Pakistani descent, and a strong workforce that's been drawn from the Philippines. So 90% Chinese culturally, and then this other 10% of mixed ethnicity. But I ask you just to take a look at the chart on the right-hand side. So the question that has been asked to Hong Kongese is, how would you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as a Hong Konger? Do you identify yourself as Chinese? Do you identify yourself as mixed, or perhaps you don't know, or other? If you take a look at those folks in Hong Kong who are 60 and above, what you're seeing there in that blue line is this identification of mixed identity. So I see myself as Chinese and Hong Kongese, and they're blended together. That's how I see myself. You'll see if you go back to sort of the 50 to 59-year-olds, that's a very similar trend. But as soon as you get to the 30 and below, that starts to change. And there's this strong sense for these folks of seeing themselves as Hong Kongese. And at 30 and below, almost nobody identifying as Chinese. So in terms of a mindset and in terms of you being successful and thinking about, how you might operate, there's a few takeaways from that. One is that sense of identity is changing fast. 2 is we can see at the same time in parallel a strong China desire to bring the families back closer together. But 3 is you can see a younger generation or younger demographic that is not comfortable with that conversation and sees themselves as quite distinct in terms of what they stand for and what they value. Word of advice, and I guess it's no different than some of the conversations we've been having in Australia as we think about Black Lives Matter, if we think about Me Too. There are topics that are really sensitive, and it's just worthwhile not spending too much time on when you think about how you engage in Hong Kong. And certainly the conversation around the Hong Kong-China relationship is not a conversation that many folks feel comfortable speaking about. Just sharing, as I had mentioned earlier on, I've spent time, I first started working in Hong Kong in 1999, lived there in the early 2000s, spent time back working again from 2015 through to that 2019. Coming into this session today, I was really curious just to ask folks that I spend a lot of time with, you know, how are you feeling when you look at what you've seen over the last 12 months in terms of implications for Australian organisations and what that might mean for a group of leaders that I'm speaking to this week. Not a single of those individuals was comfortable or willing to share a point of view on that. So I'm sharing that with you for folks that I've known for quite some time and spent time working with and in friendship groups. There's just a real level of discomfort to talk about and bring that up. So what does that mean, I guess, in terms of how you might think about being impactful within Hong Kong? Let's take a look at a few things that you could focus on and might be useful. When we think about how things get done in different markets, one of the key dimensions that is quite useful to think about is, you know, is the focus more on the what we do, the deal, getting the deal done, or is the focus more on the how we do it and who we do it with, that relationship focus? And love to see some guesses at where we think, which countries might you think are the most relationship focused? Anybody that wasn't with me last week? Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to call out. Or Shahira. Yeah. So we see countries like Japan, China, India right up there in terms of it's the how you do it and who you do it with that's most important to focus on in terms of getting work done. Australia, not surprisingly, is at the other end of the spectrum. We really think that by focusing on the what we do, focusing on the task, that builds connection and that builds trust. Hong Kong comes right there in the middle. So more relationship focused than we are in Australia, but certainly not as focused as you might see in China or Japan. And we're just sharing that in terms of what does that mean then when you start to think about where are there similarities and differences between Australia and Hong Kong as you start to think about how you might operate and how you might set yourself up for success. Here at Asialink Business, we use a quite simple model, which I just like to share with you for a minute. It's a tool called GlobeSmart. There are many, many people over the last decades who've spent lots of time researching and thinking about how countries and cultures are similar and different. What GlobeSmart's done is really pulled all of that research together into a really simple framework that says, okay, if you have not spent years and years researching the similarities and differences between cultures, how could we simplify that on a page that gives you a little bit of a ready reckoner as you're getting ready to go into the market, which helps you think about how we're similar and different. And the intention of this is really to say, look, it's a framework that helps raise self-awareness within Australia. And as we just completed our own iceberg, you would have been thinking, we're not all the same. Every Australian is different, depending on our own family, our own state, our own background. And it's absolutely the same in every culture. There's no one mold. But what this framework helps us do is look for where there are some general trends and traits. Obviously behaviour is different. No one size fits all, and it will be different in different contexts. But what the data's been able to do is come up with some averages. So on average in Hong Kong, you might see folks who look more this way. On average in Australia, you might see folks who act more this way. So here are the 5 dimensions. This is called a play at home. So as you're sitting there, whether you're sitting in your office or whether you're sitting in your home study or you're sitting in your car, wherever it is that you're taking this webinar from now, I just want to run through the dimensions. You can see that there are 5 and basically there's a scale. You could be more to the right or more to the left. I'd love you just to map yourself along that scale as we run through. So that first dimension is focused on our sense of where do we draw our identity from? Do we draw our identity from our individual self, so being more independent, or do we draw our identity more from the group? And so really simply, on the left-hand side, what we are more likely to do in terms of, our identity is put importance on individual identity. We prefer to take action on our own. We see ourselves as being responsible for ourselves. On the right-hand side, the emphasis is much more on the group. And in the group, it's really important to harmonise and cooperate. And we really derive our sense of identity from being in the group. So I'd love you just to map yourself. I'm not going to ask you where you mapped yourself, but would you see yourself as being more independent or more interdependent in terms of your identity? More individual or more connected to the group? The second dimension is how we feel about our relationship to hierarchy and how groups should be structured and how power should be distributed. Our iceberg example is a bit of a giveaway for us here in Australia, in the sense of, on that left-hand side, the label is egalitarianism, but really that's that piece around being comfortable challenging the views of other people, regardless of where they are in the hierarchy. So equally comfortable challenging your manager as challenging one of your team members. So this sense that everybody has a point of view and everybody's point of view is valued. On the right-hand side, the status is around preferring not to challenge folks who are above you. The sense of we should adapt our behaviour to be differential to those who have authority, those who've been around for a long time. And we're assuming that power and authority sits with a few rather than sits with all. So again, for you, would you like to just map yourself somewhere along that dimension? And then let's just move on to that third dimension, which is really the degree to which we feel comfortable with uncertainty. So on the left-hand side, what you've got is a comfort with risk-taking. So for cultures where we're comfortable with risk-taking, we like quite rapid decision-making. We're quite comfortable with flexibility and changing things in the moment. And we really value speed over thoroughness. It's better to be fast than to be perfect. On the right-hand side, what you see there is this desire for certainty. Let's avoid risks. Let's take more of a long-term view. And we're going to spend more time just being sure that we know stuff, getting background information together, making sure we're really clear about the proper procedures for getting things done. And I guess on this side, you'd say what's more important is being thorough and being correct versus being first. So again, just map yourself. Where would you put yourself, and perhaps in the context of Australia, where might you put yourself? The fourth one is really the level of directness. And this is particularly around communication. And I think it was either Tanya or Cosi that called this out as something that's very Australian, actually, that left-hand side. Coming to the point quite quickly, being quite direct in terms of asking questions, being comfortable to ask for information, being comfortable to give feedback, whether it's positive or negative. On the right-hand side, we've got communication which is more indirect. There's more time in this dimension, on the indirect, of explaining the context, finding ways around the problem, finding ways without words to communicate what you want and what you don't want, and a much more subtle way of communicating than you would see on the left-hand side. And then that final dimension, which is what I might call the basis for trust, which is really that piece that we just talked about. You know, when we're thinking about the deal, do we focus more on getting the task done, you know, high value on reaching goals and objectives? Or do we focus more on let's build a relationship? Because if we have a strong relationship, if we've connected that way, and if we prioritize maintaining the relationship, then for the longer term, that's going to give us the kind of economic outcome that we want. So if you've been playing that at home, you should have a little map which says, you know, on those 5 dimensions, here's where I fit. And you can just take a pen and draw a line from sort of top to bottom, a sort of a zigzag or a swirl, might be a straight line, depending on where you've come, which gives your profile, I guess, from a Globe Smart point of view. So typically, this is the way that you would like to interact. Because now we'd like to share with you how that looks when we look at Australia and Hong Kong. And just as we get ready to do that, I think one of the things that you're just seeing here is what we know, and what you would have picked up too, is that Hong Kong is this amazing kind of melting pot of where we see what we say East meets West. And there are, from those dimensions that we've just looked at, that Globe Smart profile, elements of Hong Kong which you might expect to see in a more Confucian Chinese context. So the sense of being part of the group's important. Where you fit in the group is important too. This need to save face and give face. And I know we don't use that term a lot in Australia, but you'll see it a lot when we talk about what we're seeing in different Asian contexts. And face is really around ensuring that we show respect to those who should be respected, linked again to particularly status and from that Confucianism elders. And face is also about ensuring that we don't cause others to be embarrassed or disrespected or lose face ourselves by doing things, making mistakes, which would cause us to feel foolish or embarrassed. And those things are part of what you will see in Hong Kongese context. However, equally, you know, you'll see that there's this really strong focus on innovation. It's been very prosperous. So it's high quality living, and there's striving because of this hive and hub of activity to continue to really be enterprising and thinking about new and different ways to do things. And this, you know, real sticking to the sense of wanting to be free. So I guess the word we use is, you know, this hub, the fact that you kind of see 2 systems in one country, although that terminology is disappearing fast in terms of what we're seeing. So the map, the quick profile, any surprises? What you've got on the left-hand side is typically what we see in Australia. So much more focus on me, less on the group. What does that mean then if you're coming into Hong Kong to work? Is being conscious of who's in the group, being conscious of coming in the context of your broader connections too. So not just your individual organization, but, you know, who else you're part of in terms of the pink body. How are you connected? How are you connecting them to this group? How are you ensuring that there's harmony and connection across the group? Not surprising too, in Australia, we are pretty egalitarian. So we do have a sense that my opinion is equally valuable, that I should speak up and speak out. Again, in a Hong Kong context, that's typically not what would be expected. If you disagree, if you have different points of view, it certainly would be expected that those are dealt with not in an open forum, but those are dealt with in more indirect ways, and that there will be decision makers who hold more power as you're starting to think about who you talk to and who you connect with. And so your ability to navigate and read that's quite important. Again, in terms of making decisions, in Australia, we're pretty comfortable with being a little bit uncertain. We're pretty comfortable with things changing at the last minute. You might find that partners in Hong Kong are less comfortable. They can go between the two, but a lot of late changes, last minute changes, or just in time doesn't sit well with a Hong Kong partner. When we look at communication again, you can see, not surprisingly, we talked about it already, there's this kind of Hong Kong, Hong Kong is more indirect. So when you think about how do I communicate, how do I give feedback, how do I find out what's really going on, it's not always going to be okay to ask directly or to email directly. You might need to ask more questions, more open-ended questions, ask at different layers of the hierarchy, and really watch for what's not being said, as well as what is being said. And then the final piece we already talked about a little bit briefly, which is when in Australia, we're quite focused on the task. So when I work on new projects, when I'm setting up a new business opportunity, I want to work on getting stuff done, because if I get stuff done, that means we're going to be successful. On the Hong Kong side, not surprisingly, while there is a focus on, of course, getting stuff done, and you see that in the speed and the hours and the energy that's worked, there's equally an importance of knowing that you're around for the long term, knowing that you're committed to building a relationship that will last. And that looks like what you're willing to give early, the kind of investments that you're willing to make, and the fact that converting business or signing a deal won't happen at a first meeting or even a second. It's really around showing that you're committed and connected for the longer term. So I'm going to just have a quick in the chat. Any big surprises in terms of that difference between Hong Kong and Australia in terms of doing work? Or things that you perhaps didn't expect? Well, perhaps in that case, it feels familiar. I guess what we would encourage you to think about, if we go back to that sort of framework in terms of building up your cultural intelligence, because understanding that context, knowing what it would take to be successful in the Hong Kong market is just a good kind of stock take, in the sense of what would you need to do next to ensure that if this is the market that you do decide to export into, you will be able to be successful. So there's a few just key tips that we would suggest. And when you look at those differences between Australia and Hong Kong, things that might not come as naturally but will be important in terms of ensuring the business is set up for success is certainly focusing on building personal connections. And you can do that in lots of different ways. In the same way that you would do it here in Australia, being connected through family and friends. In Hong Kong, it's really also about taking the time to make those personal connections beyond just the task that you're focused on. When you are meeting with new partners for the first time, do think about getting the right level of formality and interaction in place. As a naive sort of first-time person in Hong Kong, back in my first time being based there in the early 2000s, I was fortunate to be working on the PCCW acquisition of Hong Kong Telecom. But I was unfortunate in that I really had not done enough homework, and my organisation hadn't done enough homework around how we could be useful in that context. And the first meeting that I went to with the Hong Kong Telecom CEO was myself, a young woman in her 20s, with another female colleague who was also young in her 30s. Just the two of us, and we were late. And I share that because that was, in terms of the things that you look at here, matching a status, being able to navigate that certainty versus uncertainty, those were the two biggest black marks that we could possibly have had. And being underprepared, and inappropriate in that context was really something that I wouldn't wish on anybody. So just having that formality and same level of interaction is super important. The face saving and giving and building respect is something that we don't do it as commonly here in Australia. So finding ways to acknowledge contribution, finding ways to acknowledge profile, acknowledge your partners is important, and finding ways to minimize any of the negative elements of a relationship will be important too. And I guess we would just finally say that, you know, the relationship is your capital. So it's social capital that actually will play quite a big part in terms of your ability to succeed and be in Hong Kong for the longer term. Look, I appreciate I'm just on time. I'd love to refer you to a few resources that you might be able to use after this session. There's not a lot, you know, it's in an hour we really run through quite quickly. But at Asialink, we've developed a series of country starter packs, which really are designed to help Australian businesses navigate new markets. So you can see we've got a whole series of starter packs. But if you pop to the website, you'll be able to download the Hong Kong starter pack and other country starter packs that might be useful for you. So I'd encourage you, the information that we've covered today is certainly contained within the starter pack, and use that as your starting guide for next steps as you get ready for your journey. I'm going to take a break for a minute here. Thanks so much. I feel like I've talked at you. Thanks, Tanya and Cozy, for the dialogue back in the chat. But as we just wrap up, I'd love to know if there are any questions or things that I've raised that aren't clear, or anything else that might be useful in terms of the journey that you're on. Well, look, it's been wonderful to have time with you all this morning. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Najib, I'm going to hand to you for the next part of the session as we really get into some of the nuts and bolts of thinking about the export context and environment. So over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really insightful. And in fact, a lot of what you shared there will frame some of the context of the market data that we're going to share in terms of understanding what the opportunities are for the food and agribusinesses on this webinar. So we will take a 5-minute break. So the timing is good. So it'll be 12:15 in the Eastern Seaboard. I think we have people on this call from New Zealand, from Bolivia, and a few other places as well. So wherever it is in your part of the world, but at 15:15, we'll come back on and we'll start the Export Connect part of this webinar. See you all soon.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Hi, Najib. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too, Shari.
Thanks, everyone, for staying on. I hope you've had time to grab a coffee or a tea, getting ready for the second part of today. So I'll hand over to Najib from Export Connect to take you through the next section. Over to you, Najib.
Excellent. Thank you, Shari. Well, super excited to be talking about Hong Kong. When I think about all the markets that I've traveled to, and I think it's something like 30 plus markets that I've exported products to. In Asia, Hong Kong is in my top 2 markets that I love to visit. So I'm always excited to talk about it as a market to export to, and I always have fond memories of it. I won't share which is the other top 2 market that I like going to, because then invariably I'll end up offending someone. So I'll just say that Hong Kong is one of the top 2. Just so you know, as you're already aware, this webinar is being recorded. And if you have any questions along the way, please shoot them through on the Q&A function. Most of you are aware of who Export Connect is. For those of you that are new to this call, and there are a couple that are new, what we help food and agribusinesses export their products predominantly to the Asian and Middle East markets. And more recently, we've been helping food and agribusinesses outside of Australia come to Australia as well. We have since founding, and we will be 4 years old in June, so not 4 yet, but we'll be 4 soon. We've delivered over 180 projects for more than 120 clients. So a third of our work is repeat work, and actually half of our revenue is repeat work. So that's a wonderful validation of the work that my team has been delivering for the sector. And we're also working with organizations like Australian Organic Ltd, state government agencies and other industry associations. We've delivered over 90 workshops, of which almost half of them now have been delivered online. And we have a successful internship program here. We're very excited about the fact that we're helping young Australians and international students learn about international business in a practical, real way, outside of theory. In fact, half of our team used to be and started with Export Connect as interns and have gone on to become full-time employees. I've got Ujan and Rajeshwari with me today in the room, and so they'll be supporting us. I know that this is, everybody's gotten used to online delivery of webinars and workshops and the like, but we are still reliant on Wi-Fi. We are still reliant on technology, and so if any of you get stuck in any way, please feel free to reach out to Ujan and Rajeshwari, and they'll be able to bring you back onto the webinar. Normally, we would be in a room right now, and we would have all shaken hands in a maybe like elbows or fist pumps or something or another. So you would know who else is in the room. So what we've done is we've just brought up the logos of participants that are sitting on this webinar, just so that you know who the cohort is, who you're learning with, and maybe if you know any of these people from these organizations, you can reach out to them afterwards and comment on just how great this webinar was. So in terms of today, what we're going to be talking about today from the Hong Kong market perspective is we're going to be looking at the market selection factors. So what do you need to address and assess to determine whether a market is the right market for you? And then we're going to be providing that data on the Hong Kong market. So the economic and demographic overview, consumer and channel overviews, we're going to do a category and trade data review. We're then, when you're assessing a market and its viability for your product and your brand, you also need to understand who is in the market, who you're competing with. And so we'll look at what are the factors that you need to look for. And then we're going to use some examples from categories that were most represented in the registrations. Right, so we're going to be looking at 3 categories. We'll be sharing that. And then we will finish off by showing you how do you bring all that information that you've just aggregated to then develop a market selection scorecard to determine is Hong Kong a market for you to go to in comparison to some of the other markets that you may want to study? And then we've just got a slide about support available. It's not exhaustive, but it certainly gets you thinking about the fact that you don't need to be going on the export journey alone. So market selection factors. What do you need to know about a market? Well, you need to know about its economic performance, right? You don't necessarily want to be going to a market that's on the slide. You want to be going on a market that's on its way up. Certainly COVID has thrown a spanner in the works for many markets around the world, just about all of them. In fact, I think Vietnam perhaps didn't experience a reduction in its GDP, but just about every market in the world has, and Hong Kong has suffered pretty badly as a result of the pandemic. We look at demographic data. We know from Catherine's presentation that 90% are Chinese origin, and that means 10% are not. So we want to see what are the trends in terms of the population, but also what are the consumer trends. You'll see shortly that in Hong Kong, it's 100% urban population, so which is really good for Australian food and agribusinesses that want to sell in modern retail outlets or modern restaurants, food service, because all of it is one to different demographic, socioeconomic backgrounds, but nonetheless, modern retail and supply chains are top class. You want to look at market size, which in the case of Hong Kong, it's a small one. That's a negative of Hong Kong. You want to look at market growth prospects. You want to look at category size. So what category are you in? And is it, it could be the market size might be small, but maybe your category is pretty big relative to other export markets that you want to go to. And maybe the category growth prospects are very positive in Hong Kong or whichever market you're assessing. You need to look at the category trends, channel trends, is your product retail, food service, e-commerce, what's going on in that space. We need to understand who the competitors are. What's the dispersion rates? Good thing about Hong Kong is that while there are two dominant retailers in the brands, the banners in particular that are dominant are Welcome and Park and Shop. There are others that you can supply your product to, and especially, and looking at the attendees on this webinar, many are niche products. So supplying City Super or someone like that may be enough for you to, that may be enough business to keep to meet your export goals for Hong Kong. You need to look at trade data. Where are products from your HS code mostly going to, and looking at the Hong Kong market in particular for this, where are they mostly sourcing product with your HS code from? And that's the harmonized code system number that governments use to track product that's being exported out and in. It's used for tariffs and measurement and the like. Market access, well, beautiful thing about Hong Kong is that market access is really quite simple. So there's no tariffs, and so therefore, Hong Kong will score highly on this basis, but that's something that you need to think about when selecting markets. And what certifications are required in terms of, do you need, halal certification? Do you need kosher certification? Certainly you need, organic certification. And I think Owen's going to be speaking a little bit, after me, on organic certification with Hong Kong market in particular in mind. So let's talk about the key factors. So from a demographic indicator perspective, we've put in we're comparing Hong Kong to Australia here just to give context. 7.5 million people in Hong Kong versus 25 million people in Australia. So clearly it's a small market. Australia is not a large market itself. So that means that Hong Kong is really, it's a small, tiny market. The real positive thing, though, is that 100% of the population is urban. And so that goes to my point that I earlier shared, is that it means that from a context of, high-end product that requires an educated consumer that's probably, a professional worker, the fact that it's got a high urban population is a really big positive in terms of looking at Hong Kong as an option for our exports. Population growth rate is pretty small in Hong Kong, less than Australia, and for Australia it's not that large either. When you look at the Human Development Index, this is important for us when we look scoring overall consumer trends, is because the Human Development Index looks at things like life expectancy, education levels, and national income per capita. So what that demonstrates is that the consumer is probably more likely to be aware and concerned about what it is that they're buying, which, especially for this webinar, where most of you have certified organic products, we're hitting a bit of a sweet spot, because in Hong Kong, for the Human Development Index rank, it's 4th in the world, ranked higher than Australia. From an economic indicator perspective, the GDP is 365 billion. Australia's is 1.4 trillion. So again, it's reflected in the population size, but certainly from a GDP per capita perspective, Australia is 57,000 per person. In Hong Kong, it's 38,000, which, it's not over 50,000 like, for example, Singapore, but 38,000 is still quite a high GDP per capita figure, which would demonstrate that disposable incomes are there to spend on products that may be a little more expensive, but that are better for you. You will see the annual growth rate for the December quarter up to December 20 in Hong Kong was -3%, right? So it's suffered. It suffered a fair bit. I think over the year GDP was down 6%. But it's on its way up, like every other market around the world, generally speaking. Ease of doing business is really important for us. Why we look at that and use that in our market selection rankings is because it will help us understand, generally speaking, how easy it is to work with the buyers, how well can we be protected if there's a legal dispute, just generally the overall business climate, how easy or difficult will it be? And in Hong Kong, it's 3rd out of 190, again, higher than Australia. So that gives us confidence that we can go into the Hong Kong market and not have to stress so much about, are we going to have a lot of drama working with distributors and retailers and e-commerce platforms and the like. The Logistics Performance Index ranks, this is 2018, ranks Hong Kong as 12th in the world, ahead of Australia, and certainly also confirms Catherine's comments that Hong Kong is a re-export hub. When we look at consumer characteristics, what we've done is we've looked at what's similar between Australia and Hong Kong and consumers, and then what are the differences. And certainly when you look at the similarities, you've got high incomes, urban population, educated, reading and studying and understanding about the products that we're consuming, convenience seeking, right? So busy lifestyles, so convenience is very important. Word of mouth is particularly important as well. Health benefits have become increasingly budget conscious as a result of the pandemic, with either incomes being reduced and or a little bit of a shot in a little bit of a hit in consumer confidence, quite ethical mindset, and active online shoppers. Hong Kong, the online e-commerce sort of channel is not as anywhere near as big or as strong as China's, but it's on its way up, just like pretty much every market around the world. One of the big differences is that in Australia, generally speaking, we're not brand loyal, and in Hong Kong, generally speaking, they are. That has changed a little bit. As a result of COVID, people aren't going necessarily to the bigger stores and being loyal to the store, and therefore being loyal to what product is available in that store. Many have gone to purchase product locally, and that local store may not stock the brand that the consumers usually purchases, and so they're switching and swapping. Also, if product wasn't available because of product not being able to leave its source market, then consumers have had to try something different. Generally speaking, though, the Hong Kong consumer is brand loyal. Talking about COVID and the impact that it's had on the market, we know 41% of consumers are more selective in their purchase decisions now, so they're not as open with their wallets. They're prioritizing what it is that they're purchasing in terms of getting the essentials first before going for the experiential type purchases. GDP down 6% in 2020. I mean, that's unprecedented. In fact, the steepest annual decline on record for Hong Kong. We know from a KPMG report that almost 70% of consumers ease of purchase is their main purchase driver. So that also is driven by the convenience factor that we highlighted in the sort of the consumer trends. Unemployment is at its highest level. So that's impacted sort of the GDP per capita a little bit, but that's also impacted the confidence to be able to spend. There is a transition towards digital and omni-channel alternatives. So that was happening already before COVID. COVID has accelerated that. Good news is in Hong Kong, the government is providing a lot of fiscal support to businesses and to consumers, much in the same way that Australia has done, say, for example, with JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and the like. So the Hong Kong government is trying to jumpstart the economy. From a consumer trend perspective, and this is, looking at it in terms of what we've just covered earlier, and at a high level. And what we'd like to do is we look at all these and in context, and then give the market a score in terms of other trends moving in the direction that's good for our brand. This is, of course, we're sort of making the assumption here that you understand who your target customer is in Hong Kong as well, and what their attributes and lifestyle and behaviors are towards the category, and potentially towards imported product. So you need to look at this in an overall context to decide whether the Hong Kong market is good for you. So, we know that the Hong Kong consumer prefers foreign products. In most instances, they don't have a choice. About 90% of what they consume, food and agri products, is imported because it's just an island that is filled with towers and buildings. I mean, that's why it's 100% urban population. So they don't really have a lot of space to be growing produce and manufacturing it. So most of the product is imported. They particularly look for Western trends in terms of the food that they eat, and so also the way that the product is packaged, the way that the product is promoted. And so we look at how in Hong Kong they're looking to have healthier lifestyles, driven initially by working longer hours, not eating as well as they used to, and so looking for products that are good for gut health, functional foods, and the type. We're now seeing the consumers moving towards plant-based foods, and we know Green Common is a retail chain that also has their own brands and represents international brands in the Hong Kong market, has grown dramatically. And so there's a very strong interest in that category space as well. Hong Kong consumers, especially after COVID, are looking for value for money. That doesn't mean, though, that they're prepared to pay peanuts for rubbish. They are still looking for quality. You just have to be able to demonstrate to the consumer that you are offering a product that is presenting value for money. So they're paying a little more, but they're getting something that's really good for them. That hits the sweet spot, that meets their needs. Value for money has remained the steady preference for 60% of the consumers. And we know from an organic perspective, because most of you on this webinar have certified organic products, is attractive to the Hong Kong consumer. And just a little over 60% of consumers there are prepared to spend up to 20% premium for organic products if you can demonstrate that value in comparison to competitors from other markets in the world. So, don't think for one moment that the only organic products coming into Hong Kong are from Australia. They're also coming from the US and from Canada and from UK and France and Europe and wherever. So having certified organic product coming from Australia or New Zealand, for that matter, is definitely a positive, and they're prepared to pay a premium for it, but only if what you're offering and the claims that you have can be unique or present better value than the certified organic product coming from other Western source markets. When you look at the channel review, so which channels should you be selling into? Should you be focusing on retail? Should you be focusing on food service? Should you be focusing on e-commerce? Within retail, where should you be focusing? Well, we know that supermarkets, from a grocery retailing perspective, represent the largest market or market channel within the Hong Kong market. It grew quite significantly year on year, at a rate of 5% over the last 5 years. But it's expected to grow year on year at a slightly lower rate. And where a lot of that is being picked up is in convenience stores. And some of that is that behavior shift from going out to a bigger supermarket and buying your product to going down to the local convenience store and picking up what you need, on a more regular basis. Avoid that human contact, driven by, the desire to not get sick or catch any viruses. So, however, even though there's a slight decline in the supermarket base, it is still significantly the largest portion of retail, representing, nearly 8.5 billion of the $18 billion value. So it's nearly 50%. Convenience is certainly showing good uptake. Food service, as you can see, has taken a massive hit. So this is that -7% year-on-year negative growth over the last 5 years. Is the entire loss has been just in 1 year, in 2020. So that will help you understand how big the hit is for food service in the Hong Kong market. And so as a result, it's expected to grow at a pretty high rate, but coming off a significantly lower base than what it used to be. And so food service is almost, at a total value, is going to be almost on par with grocery retailing in year on year over the next 5 years, as forecast by Euromonitor. Now, the e-commerce figures that you see there, this is for e-commerce in total. So this isn't e-commerce food and agri, this is e-commerce in total. So significant growth year on year over the last 5 years, of which the majority of that was over 2020. But e-commerce was growing year on year already anyway, before the pandemic hit. And it is expected to continue to grow in double-digit growth rates year on year over the next 5 years at a slightly decreasing amount, but still, quite significant growth. And it'll exceed supermarket channel in about 5 years' time. But again, note, this is e-commerce in total, not just food and agri. If you're looking at just food and agri, supermarket channel is still going to be significantly, by far, a lot bigger than the e-commerce channel. So the point there is, if you have a product that's durable and good for e-commerce, then you definitely need to be active in that channel. But if you're trying to achieve, if export sales value is important to you, and so, doing a bit of volume, you definitely have to be getting into the retail market as well. You can't just rely on e-commerce. And speaking of grocery retail trends, so these slides, when you'll see this, so we've got one for food service and e-commerce as well. On the right-hand side, we have the sort of the key banners, key brands, key retailers, key food service outlets, chains, just to give you an understanding of who you should be researching and targeting along the way. So food retail was Hong Kong has had a few hiccups of late. Pandemic is obviously one, but before that, you know, there was a lot of the protests and the sort of the rioting that was going on, which resulted in some you know, supermarket outlets having to close their supermarkets. But despite that, the food retail industry was largely unaffected. And of course, the benefit it had from the pandemic is that consumers that used to go out to eat out had to go to the supermarkets to buy food to eat in. So the domination there is A.S. Watson and Dairy Farm International. So A.S. Watson owns, if you have a look on the right-hand side, they own the Park and Shop banner, Fusion. They own Great. They own Taste. And the Dairy Farm International, the banners that it owns is Welcome. It owns 360. It owns Marketplace, and it owns Oliver's. So you can see these two groups, you know, that they own a fair bit. City Super is a fabulous high-end supermarket chain of only some 7 stores. But every time I had been going to Hong Kong, and for a period of almost a decade, I had been going once or twice a year. In particular, the stores in Soho, Times Square, and the International Trade Center, heaving with people. City Super is a very popular retail outlet. Vanguard is also owns the Olay banner, which is a high-end retailer supermarket chain in China. And in Hong Kong, they've been trying to go a little bit more upmarket. So when I was there just before the pandemic hit, they had already about 25 high-end banner stores, and they were looking to grow that significantly. They're the main points for the grocery retailing trends. When we look at the food service trends, you know, big hit. It fell by 30% in 2020, and so, you know, and then affected even before that through the rioting, and then the trade wars with between China and the US. The full service restaurants are the ones that experienced the steepest declines. So over 35% decline. So these are ones, you know, table service, as opposed to the limited service restaurants, which are sort of the fast food chains. We do know within food service, as in retail branded products, that they are looking for healthier options, better for you options. That's being, and also for plant-based options. This is certainly a trend that is happening in the food service channel in Hong Kong, in addition to retail and e-commerce for that matter. And so once travel gets back, I think the point here is once travel gets back, tourism comes back, food service will come back, and that was certainly identified in the expectant growth year on year within the food service channel over the next 5 years. What we'll see also is, in the past, a lot of the consumers that would go out and eat at the restaurants, and so that was where you'd see a lot of the volume of ingredient sales going into the restaurants and cafes and bars. Now there's also, in addition to that, there's going to be a lot of home delivery as well. So if your product is well suited somehow in some way to be used to then be picked up and delivered to the homes, you know, maybe if you've got some pre-prepared meals that can go through that kind of a sort of a channel, through the food service channel, then certainly having the ability to be transported and moved around will give you a big advantage. When we look at the full service restaurants, they're mostly by far Asian inspired cuisine, then followed by the European cuisine, North American, other pizza full service restaurants only represent very small portion there. In some of the other markets that we study, pizza full service restaurants are actually quite can represent, you know, up to 5, 6, 7% of that market. And so you see on the the banners on the right, you know, most of them do have Asian influence to represent the dominance in that space. When we look at limited service restaurant breakdown, you know, a lot of these brands who you're all familiar with, you know, 7-Eleven is quite significant in Hong Kong, as it is across most Asian markets. And of course, they've got the noodles and you know, another food that you can heat in the convenience store and take away and eat. So that qualifies it for limited service restaurant dining. So there we've got the dominant part that we can see is the burger limited service restaurants, and then we see chicken. So you know, so a lot of this, and this is, you know, this would be driven by McDonald's and KFC and the like, and then you start seeing the rest coming in. Many of it offered through 7-Eleven, in particular, sort of the Asian limited service restaurant type would fit into that space. So you know, quite a mix there. But of those of you that are on this call that are in the beef and chicken space, then there's a lot of opportunity from limited food service. From an e-commerce perspective, prior to COVID and prior to sort of China becoming a powerhouse in the e-commerce space, Hong Kong was really quite slow to adapt to e-commerce, and it didn't really need to, because there's so many supermarkets, so many convenience stores, so much was available at the bottom of where everybody lived or worked. Remember, it's 100% urban population, so you didn't really need to go far to find a store to be able to buy your products, to either consume there at their restaurants or to buy and take away. COVID has certainly accelerated the e-commerce channel as being an opportunity for food and agribusinesses to sell product through. And so now over 70% of consumers in Hong Kong engage in online grocery retail platforms. Now, sometimes that might be just like small amounts that they're buying, but nonetheless, they're starting to use it. And, you know, once you use something and if you see benefit in it, then you'll keep going and buying more. What also they've had has worked well for them is many of these bigger retailers, so Park and Shop and City Super and Welcome, they in a way saw the e-commerce channel growing, and so they started developing better e-commerce platforms. And so when COVID hit, they were ready to pick up the extra sales and the growth. And of course, there are other e-commerce platforms that don't have shops like HKTV Mall, which is the largest online platform in China, and moving very heavily into the grocery and fresh produce sort of space. Omni-channel retailing is going to be important for the likes of Park and Shop and City Super and Welcome, and that's where consumers can either buy a brand in store or online. They may do their research in store and then purchase the product online and have it delivered home. So we look at so we've had a look at the demographic data, and we looked at the economic data, and we would have given Hong Kong a score for how suitable it is for our products. We would have looked at the consumer trends. We've looked at the channel trends, and we would have given that a score in terms of how relevant or how good is the Hong Kong market for our brands and our products. So the next thing we need to look at is the category information, and how well is our category that our product is in performing in the Hong Kong market. So when we look at organic packaged foods in the Hong Kong market, we've got a few categories listed there. And what we can see in terms of year-on-year growth over the next 5 years, the big performers, the ones that are showing most potential, are baby food, And from that, we can also see the market value, the category value for baby food is quite high at 120 million US. So this is just retail sales. But other really good performers, we can see is bread, breakfast cereals, dairy products. We can see ice cream looking to have some good growth. We've got rice, pasta, noodles, sauces, condiments, dressings, spreads, and even some of the snacking items showing good growth, albeit, and for all of those, coming off a very small base, right? So the certified organic market in Hong Kong is still quite small. It's certainly not the UK, it's certainly not Sweden, it's certainly not Germany. It's still quite a small market. But there in itself, that's a challenge on the one hand, but there in itself is an opportunity, because we do know that 60% of consumers there are willing to pay up to 20% more for organic products, and that's because they're looking for better for you, healthier type foods. And whether it makes sense or not, they perceive that organic foods are actually better for you. When we look at organic beverage, really the biggest growth we can see happening in Hong Kong is in the organic fruit and vegetable juice space. It's going to be over 6% growth year on year over the next 5 years, according to Euromonitor. But there's still, some growth in the tea and coffee space. Certainly, we're seeing bigger growth in organic coffee in some of the other Asian markets. When we look at tea specifically, because we've got a few tea businesses on this webinar, and so on the right here, so in the retail, so on the channel overviews, we had the key banners of the supermarkets, e-commerce channels, and the key chains for full service and limited service restaurants. In the category specific one, here we've got the key brands, players in the space in terms of market share and value. So it did post good growth in retail and volume sales in 2020, but off a small base, right? So and so the forecast for it to grow is not going to be as it's not forecast to grow as much as what it had over 2020. But it's still an opportunity, because we do know that there's a heightened health consciousness in the Hong Kong market. In particular, when you're looking at some of the green teas, the more floral kind of teas, tea that sort of has a point of difference and can demonstrate good health attributes, there is opportunity there. So while the growth, the rate of growth may not be as high as some of the other categories, certainly it is going to be higher, and it is trending in a category that there is some interest in. The challenge for tea is that on the flip side, outside of retail, food service sales collapsed because people stopped going to restaurants and tea houses because of the social restrictions that came with the pandemic. This is expected to come back, but it's going to take a little bit of time and move. And of course, e-commerce channel is where a lot of the growth in tea sales is being experienced. The important thing is, if you're going to be taking a tea product from Australia to Hong Kong, there has to be something really unique about it. It can't be the same, Sri Lankan sort of tea that some of the bigger players in the market already have, because they'll have the price advantage, and it's just going to be difficult for you to drive it. Because while there is an opportunity for good quality different teas in the Hong Kong market, you're going to have to pitch hard and strong with the retailers there, because they're not seeing tea as being one of the big category growth opportunities for them. When we look at trade data, so we look at the category data, and then we look at the sort of the trade data. And so here we look at where does tea from Australia get exported, and where does tea get imported from into Hong Kong. So here we're using the HS code of 0902. So high level for digit, it goes up to 8 digits. So it can get quite specific. So for tea, whether or not flavored, we know that the imported value of tea into Hong Kong is $186 million worth. And that makes it actually the 12th largest importer of tea using this code in the world. According to UN Comtrade statistics, about $39,000 worth, US dollars worth of tea comes into Hong Kong from Australia. According to ABS statistics, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics, about $123,000 worth goes to Hong Kong from Australia. So you see there's a disparity in the values, and sometimes it's just, you know, the official keeping of information in the receiving market is just not consistent with that that's going out. But here I feel like the reason why there's quite a bit of disparity is because the product is being exported to, so Australia documents that product being exported from Australia to Hong Kong. And so that's the value it thinks that is being exported to Hong Kong. But actually, a lot of that product may be destined for Macau or China. And so it goes through the bonded system and re-exported. And so in Hong Kong, they don't capture it as an import because that doesn't actually end up in Hong Kong. It's just transiting through Hong Kong. When we look at where does Australian tea mostly go, it mostly goes to New Zealand, followed by Japan, Germany, China, USA, Netherlands, UK, Malaysia, Fiji. Hong Kong is 10th. So when assessing which markets to go to, you may want to have a look at this data. This may inform you to, in fact, focus on some different markets. And when you look at Japan, Germany, China, USA, I mean, these are all really difficult markets to export to. So once you start eliminating these, you may think to yourself, okay, I'm going to target New Zealand, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. If you're going to select 3, if you're using only trade data as your, decision-making tool. When we look at breakfast cereals, some of the key brands are there on the right. So as long as your breakfast cereal is a healthier option, then definitely there's some growth and opportunity there for you. The market is traditionally not a cereal eater, but it has moved over into that space over the last few decades. Again, this move towards sort of more Western style foods. Muesli and granola are the most dynamic subcategory within the breakfast cereal category, and that's largely because of the perceptions that it's a healthier, better for you type food. Certainly for children, if you've got better for you foods that are still fun to eat, then you're going to see some really good opportunities for your brand. But it is a very competitive space. So you have to really understand your target consumer. You have to understand what are they looking for. You have to understand who your competitors are, know where you're different, demonstrate to the trade that they should be taking your product on because you're meeting a niche that otherwise is not being met by the other products that are being imported into the market. And if you're in the sort of granola and muesli space, you're off to a very good start. From a trade data perspective, according to UN Comtrade statistics, which is what Hong Kong uses to record its imports, about nearly $700,000 US worth of Australian breakfast cereals were exported to the Hong Kong market. And when we look at which markets do we mostly export breakfast cereals to from Australia, we see New Zealand, China, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Singapore, USA. So a bit more of a mix between big, complex, sophisticated markets versus smaller markets or less mature markets. The stats from ABS is more than $1 million worth of Australian exports go to Hong Kong. So again, I feel like the difference is re-export related. And ready-to-eat meals is the third one that is most represented by the companies that are attending this webinar. And so there, you see 7-Eleven and Circle K, like, these are convenience stores, so they're quite high up because of that, selling the it's considered ready meals where you just sort of have to add the water to consume the food. It's growing. It's growing. It was already growing before the pandemic. The pandemic has only accelerated that. We are seeing this noodles type, this convenience store type meals continue to grow rapidly from a convenience perspective. We are also seeing growth in the frozen ready meals space. A, because they've got longer shelf life. But B, also, if they can demonstrate healthy functional attributes, then the Hong Kong consumer is gravitating towards them. In particular, if it's plant-based, ready-to-eat meals, which if it's got high protein, low sugar, nutrient-rich, it's definitely an area that is experiencing a lot of interest in that type of product. When we look at ready meals, the HS code there, it's the HS code for ready meals is not a clear one. So, when you're studying this, you've got to look at trade data sets of a few different codes. So for this one, we picked one for the purpose of this workshop. Otherwise, we'll be going on forever on this. But for 2204, which is vegetables prepared or preserved, otherwise, you got the data there. Exports from Australia to Hong Kong is around about $100,000 US. But again, quite a specific sort of HS code for prepared meals. It could be outside of that. And when we look at ABS statistics, it's got 113,000 going to Hong Kong. So actually there it correlates. So there we get a feel that in terms of ready meals, there's probably not a lot of re-export going on. And when we look at the where does Hong Kong mostly get their ready meals from, it's by far the dominant one is the US. And when we look at where do we mostly export ready meals from Australia to, it's mostly New Zealand, US, and then we start looking at a few Asian and Pacific markets. You may say, well, that's great, Najib. So you've just shared all this data that we can use to determine whether the markets are right for us or not. But where do you get this information from? So there's so many places you could go to. Certainly, Australian Organic Limited is doing a great job in helping its members and those within the certified organic community learn more about export through their Trade Organic website, where a lot of these webinars and content is being resides, and Australian Organic Limited has a lot more in play in the organic space that'll come in the months and years to come. But you can, Euromonitor is where we source a lot of our information from, and so you can either subscribe to Euromonitor, which is super expensive, or you could scour reports from other country trade agencies, the Australian equivalents of Canada and US and whatever. If you go through enough information, you'll be able to pull out the kind of data that you need there. FIAL has some information. Asialink, they got their country reports, which, sort of on a cultural perspective, when you're looking at consumer trends, demographics, you might be able to use that information to help you score the relevance of a market for you to go to. I mean, there's a whole bunch there. I'm not going to mention every one, but so you have to be ready to spend a bit of time doing your research to be able to figure out, this kind of data sets, what's going to be, if the Hong Kong market is right for you, or any other market for that matter. Or you can come to Export Connect, and we have all that information synthesized for you in a handful of pages that makes it easier for you. So we've looked at all that desktop research. Now we need to understand who our competitors are in market, right? So we've got a good feel for trends, for values, for growth rates, for the demographics, and where that economy of the market we're looking at is heading. We need to now see who our are our key competitors in the market. And so to be able to understand who our key competitors are, we have to first of all document, the brand name, and have an image of it, and pull this together in a sort of a spreadsheet that allows you to be able to in a very quickly assess and address the points of difference. So you can demonstrate if you're offering value for money to your consumer. So you may recall earlier on in this presentation, value money is even more important in the Hong Kong market as a result of the pandemic than what it was beforehand. We need to know the product weight to determine the price per gram, to determine value for money on a pricing level. Obviously the price, and then we need to do the conversion, which I think it's about 5.9 Hong Kong dollars to $1 Australian dollar at the moment. Where's the product being manufactured? We're not really going to compare ourselves against product that's manufactured in China or like markets. We want to be comparing ourselves to a product that's manufactured in North America or in Europe, UK, New Zealand, and even to an extent Japan and Korea. Japanese and Korean manufactured food products do have a good reputation, and so depending on what product you have, you may need to be studying brands coming in from those source markets as well. We need to look at product claims. Obviously, the big one for us on this webinar is certified organic. Type of packaging, is it small? Is it large? Medium size? Is it glass, plastic, retort? Is it cardboard? What kind of packaging is being used? What position in store? Is it only in the category space on the shelf or in the fridge, in the freezer? Or is the product like condiments available in the deli section, in the condiment section, and then maybe in the fresh produce section? So where's product available and what kind of promotions are being run? First of all, you need to see that to understand maybe the product price that you have may be abnormally low because it's been on promotion. But then also you need to see what promotions are being held, because you yourself will need to promote your brand. If you want to do more than just have your product on shelf, you got to get it moving off the shelf. And what kind of activity, what kind of activation do you need to drive in the Hong Kong market? And so one of the best ways to figure that out is to ask a distributor and a retailer. The other way is to see actually what's happening in market, in particular in your category, and what are your main competitors doing. Importer distributor details are actually available on the packaging. It's mandatory to have that. And so that will help you understand who are the distributors that are bringing your competitors' products in. Is it the retailer themselves doing a direct import, or is it going through an importer and distributor? Why that's important is because you may choose to avoid that importer and distributor because you don't want to have conflict of interest, or you may decide to use that importer and distributor because while it may be in your category, your product may be different to them. So they may be bringing in a conventional product, a conventional breakfast cereal, and yours is a certified organic breakfast cereal. So they're already going to the right places, but you're offering them like a brand with a point of difference, being certified organic. So it is good to see who your imported distributors are. Take a photo of the category. So this is in when we're all able to travel again. Don't just take a photo of the products of your competitors, take a photo of the whole shelf space itself if you can. What we're doing now for our clients is, in addition to taking a category photo, is actually taking a category video. So we're trying to help replicate the market visit experience. We can't travel and walk down the aisle, but we're getting our in-market representatives to go out into the supermarket chains and film the aisle where they can. It's not always easy. It's not always allowed, but where we can, we try and replicate that experience. What we do for our clients that have food service product is look at the menus of the types of restaurants and cafes that our clients' products target. And on the menu, sometimes they have where the product is sourced from, but otherwise, you get a good feel for what type of ingredients they have from the type of meals that they're serving. When we're allowed to travel, sometimes asking wait staff is a good way to get information from the food service channel perspective, just like the way sometimes asking the merchandisers in the supermarkets to get some good perspective of what's going on in your category in retail. And then once you've got the information from food service, once you've got information from retail, once you've done your e-commerce channel review as well, platform review, you then compare across all the channels, and then you sort of get a bit of a context as to what the real opportunity is for your brand. Here, when we look at tea and sticking to the theme of tea, breakfast cereals, and ready meals, we've just, this is like, we've just picked six products outright, but normally when we do a competitor assessment, we're looking at minimum 100 brands that we like to compare against from around the world, mostly from, where possible, we try and compare mostly against North American and Kiwi and European products and Australian products, because that's mostly who we're competing with. So here, from a tea perspective, we can see some, fluctuations in price up to $13, $15. Certainly the Australian product there in Australian dollars is amongst the more expensive for 60 grams. You got a UK product coming in at 100 grams for nearly half the price. All right, so if you love tea, you'd want to be able to clearly articulate how you're different to the other teas in there. Why would a consumer pay a premium for your product over theirs? When we look at breakfast cereals, we've got the Woolworths macro organic range there. We know that Woolworths is selling a lot of product through Park and Shop. They've set up a deal with Park and Shop, so they're only selling to Park and Shop, and the Park and Shop is taking hundreds of their SKUs, in fact. So that Woolworths is doing quite well in the Hong Kong market. So when looking at their rolled oats, how does it compare with the UK rolled oats, which are actually really expensive compared to the Woolworths product. And is that because the UK product is a lot better? In which case, Woolworths needs to understand that to be able to then do the pitch and explain that their product is best in terms of value for money, in terms of hitting a better price point to take the consumer that's not going to spend as much, the more budget conscious consumer as a result of the pandemic. That would be their sort of pitch to have their product in the market. And ready meals. So, there's some plant-based meals there that we've got. So there's a Bayer Natura from Germany, which, has got their patties at $7.75. From Australia, there's some silk and egg tofu. So tofu obviously is a staple, but there you can see some of the big brands. I mean, a lot of people have heard of Beyond Meat, and obviously Jamie Oliver's got his sort of meals, and there's quite a bit of fluctuation in price there as well. So being able to articulate your point of difference is going to be key. So then once you've got the information, you need to document it. So too often I see exporters will just scribble their notes on, maybe the hotel pad, and then they've got to come back and make meaning of it. What's really important is to document it in a way that you can use it. So this is an example of something we did for a baby food company for the Indonesian market. And there we got our reps to go and visit 4 key retailers, and there we documented which outlet they went to, product name, weight, price, price per unit, because we know the margins for distributors and retailers and clearance sort of charges in Indonesia. We were able to guesstimate the price that their competitors are landing into Indonesia for. We plugged that in against our client's price, and so there we can see where in green, where can they present value for money versus those in red where they may not be able to. But to confirm that, we then continue on and have a look what country was the product manufactured in, and so there we can see where we're losing is against Indonesian manufactured product. And so that in itself is one of our points of difference. But we also have a look at the product claims, type of packaging, where it's sold, and what was on promotion too. So here, this again, we always have a minimum of 100 sort of brands, provided that the category has that many brands in it, in our assessments, to be able to figure out exactly where we sit from a value proposition perspective. And so then now, Having had a look at the economic data, so in this case, the GDP growth rate, GDP per capita, having a look at consumer trends, having a look at, within the consumer trends, we're looking at demographic data as well, looking at the ease of doing business, looking at the channel trends, so what's going on in retail, food service, e-commerce, and what is our product most likely to be sold in. Having a look at category trends, right? So in this particular case, we're looking at a baby food example in terms of the overall value of the category and the growth opportunity within the category and the trends. Then looking at the import trade data and then looking at the competitor review, we're able to start giving some scores to compare various markets. And so this is the scoring criteria that we used for this particular example. The scoring criteria can change depending on the market that you go to. And so in this particular instance for the baby food product, we looked at Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and UAE markets. And as it transpired, the Hong Kong and Singapore markets were the top 2. Malaysia was top 3. And so in this particular instance, we would have advised our clients that if they're looking to focus on one market, they should focus on Hong Kong. If they're looking to focus on 2, it should be Hong Kong and Singapore. If they're looking to focus on 3, it should be Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. So this is all using evidence-based data, plus a little bit of intuition by giving a score in your understanding of trends from what you're able to research to figure out which are the best markets to go to. You would use in combination with this, how many email inquiries are you getting from markets and where to, are you having state government agencies or whatever coming to you and saying, we're getting lots of inquiries for this particular category. So you look at it in a holistic way, but certainly this is the right way to approach assessing a market. And all the examples we used up above were for those 3 categories within the Hong Kong market. So hopefully you were able to draw some information out of that you'll find useful. You don't need to get into export on your own. There's a lot of support available through Austrade, Export Council of Australia, all the different state government agencies. I mean, this isn't an exhaustive list. Food Innovation Australia Limited, of course, they've got their Meet the Buyer events. Industry associations like Australian Organic Ltd and Food SA. You might be sort of thinking, oh, this all sounds pretty difficult to understand the opportunities in the Hong Kong market. It doesn't need to be. There's a lot of help out there and available. So that closes the sort of the Export Connect presentation on the Hong Kong market. We just got 2 questions to ask you. We'll keep this quick. For us to help us understand whether the information we're sharing with you is relevant and useful, if you could just please score your overall experience with just this session. So not Catherine's session, just the session delivered now about the Hong Kong market, with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. And also it'd be good to know whether you would recommend this session to peers that are interested in developing export markets. So if you could just send those responses in. So I'm just going to have a look at Ujan's screen, because my screen is not showing how many have responded. Yeah, so we've just got, I think there's just a couple more responses, if you can send that through. And that's almost everyone. All right, if you haven't put it in, you want to get it in, quick, get it in now. Otherwise, we're done. We'll close it now. Perfect. Really happy to share that 100% recommendation level. So we're very excited about that. Thank you very much. So Shari, if you're there, we might take a 5-minute break again now. So we'll come back at 1:25 in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. Is that right, Shari? We'll get back on again at 1:25, and then we'll all get to hear Owen share his piece about certified organic products in the Hong Kong market.
Perfect. All right, we'll see you back then, everyone. Thanks, Najib.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody for the last session today. I'm going to hand you over to Owen William, our Chief Technical Officer, to take you through the last part. Over to you, Owen. Thank you.
Thank you, Shari. Now, are you still on screen share there, Najib? If you could disable that. There we go. Thank you. I'll just leave my video on for a moment to say hello to everyone. Thank you, Catherine and Najib, for these fantastic insights into the Hong Kong market. I'm very fortunate to be invited along on these webinars to talk about the certification and regulation side of things, because I learned so much in the process. So thank you for that. I will now go to screen share. And carry on. So yes, I am Owen William. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for Australian Organic Ltd, the industry body. Over the last 20 or almost 20 years, I've been fortunate to work in organic certification, auditing and consulting and training, and spent a lot of time in the Asia Pacific region, which has been very eye-opening and quite life-changing. Like Najib, Hong Kong is one of my favourite markets. And I do look forward to getting back there soon. Great to hear from Catherine about some of the cultural and political challenges that exist in Hong Kong. I won't go into that. I will just be talking about the requirements for exporting organic produce into Hong Kong, which is really made up of two steps. First step is getting out of Australia, and the next step, getting it into Hong Kong. So in Australia, we have the Export Control Act 2020. So it has only just come into force. However, it's fairly similar to what was already in place. So on the 28th of March, the new Export Control Act came into force. And as with the old Act, it requires for a trade description for any agricultural produce with a trade description of organic or biodynamic on the label and or on the documentation, that will make it a prescribed good. And what being a prescribed good means is that it is illegal to export it from the country unless you have the appropriate approvals in place. So organic and biodynamic labelled produce or trade description produce is a prescribed good under the Export Control Act. That means it's illegal to export it unless you have the appropriate approvals in place. And in the image there is the new Act, which is available through the federal government website. Some of the changes with the new Act were mostly just streamlining it, incorporating various different documents that existed in different places and making it more similar to other export requirements to simplify things for the process of approvals. Also, importantly, it specifically now references in the Act the national standard for organic and biodynamic produce, which is owned by the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. And it is the standard that produce needs to be certified to be able to be issued with the approval as a prescribed good leaving the country. So we're just still talking about getting organic produce out of Australia. For the moment, the Act excludes cosmetics and pet cosmetics. So those product categories can be exported, well, they're not a prescribed good, but certainly for food and textiles products, they do come under the scope of the Export Control Act as a prescribed good, and therefore need to be certified according to the national standard to be able to be legally exported. So those of you who are experienced with exporting organic produce, we will be familiar with the OPC. The E is dropped in the OPC acronym. Organic Produce Export Certificate is what they have been known as. They're now known as an Organic Goods Certificate. It's basically the same, but importantly, it's a consignment by consignment approval, which is signed off by one of the government approved certification bodies. So it's not good enough to just be certified to the national standard. You also have to have a consignment by consignment approval called an Organic Goods Certificate. It can get a bit confusing because you have your organic certificate as a certified operator, or perhaps your supplier has an organic certificate as a certified operator, which lists all the products, which is an annual renewal certificate. You also need a consignment by consignment certificate, now known as an organic goods certificate. So any of these 6 government approved organic certification bodies in Australia can issue these or can approve these on behalf of the Department of Agriculture. I hope that makes sense. Moving on to the second part. And just to note, these are all additional requirements just for organic. So all of your standard approvals are still required for that market. This is the organic add-on requirements that I'm talking about today. So I apologize, this slide's a little bit wordy. But now we're talking about the requirements at Hong Kong. And fortunately, this is one of the easiest markets for now. We haven't heard anything about any changes related to the increased reach of China within Hong Kong, because China is a difficult market to get into from a regulatory point of view. Hong Kong, for now, and we believe this will continue, is one of the easiest markets. So there's no specific organic equivalence or trade agreement in place between our governments, nor required. There are various government bodies which are somewhat involved in Hong Kong, and I've listed them here. The Centre for Food Safety is in charge of food safety, hence the name, and food-related legislation. The Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Conservation have some information on certification on their website, but there's still no firm rules about it. Inside of the food law, there is a provision for truth in labelling. So similar to Singapore, there's some potential oversight from a government regulator over in Hong Kong, purely on the basis of truth in labelling. And the existence of good explainers of what organic is on the government website suggests that they may be able to act on that. And indeed, the Hong Kong Customs and Excise Department have legislative backup to be able to act on misleading or false trade descriptions. And they could do so at any time, whether it's at the import approval process or in the marketplace over there, anywhere in the supply chain. I've never come across that in my 20 years, that any enforcement action on the Hong Kong side. But in any case, all of the Australian certification bodies via our national standard are effectively recognised by that market. So if it's, and it already has to be certified to get it out of the country here anyway, so you're unlikely to have any problem at the Hong Kong end. So continuing on about organic certification in Hong Kong, similarly, that there's no organic equivalence arrangement or trade agreement in place. There's also no specific logo required. However, you do see a range of logos in the marketplace. In my experience, the most widely seen logos, well, government level logos, are the USDA Organic and EU Organic. Our Bud logo is also very common at the retail level, and there's a strong presence of IFOAM. IFOAM certification, International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements, not a government organisation, and not a specific requirement to be certified to. However, a well-recognised logo over there by the looks of things. But USDA, EU, and our own Bud are very common in the marketplace in Hong Kong. There is a organic certification body in Hong Kong, but as Najib mentioned, 90% of the produce is being imported, so there are very few operators actually certified according to the Hong Kong Organic Resource Centre certification. Oh, I've dropped the word in there twice, apologies for that, locally. So you'll see mostly imported produce, mostly certified USDA, EU, Bud logo, occasionally IFOAM, or a mix of those logos. Often there's 2 or 3 of the same, all on the one piece of produce. All right, that is all I actually have in this slideshow. So I'll stop the screen share now, and happy to take, are we taking questions now, Shari? I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions via the chat or, yeah. So yeah, my expertise is in the certification side. If anyone has any questions specifically related to certification for export and for sale over there, now is your chance. I think if nobody has any questions for me, I'm assuming Najib and Catherine might be able to also take questions at this point.
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
I think Claire has her hand up. Najib, I'm not sure. Claire, are you trying to ask a question? Might need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, I must have covered everything thoroughly then. Thanks for listening. I hope that was helpful. Yeah, I'll hand back to you guys.
Thanks, Owen. So if there's no questions for Najib or anyone else, I think we can wrap up and have an early mark. What do you think, Najib?
I'm pretty hungry, so yeah, I'm ready to go eat.
Great.
But I'm always hungry, so that's the problem.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I know it's a lot of information in a short amount of time, especially over Zoom. I think we'll have a bit of fatigue at the moment with it. So thank you, everyone, for sticking it out with us. Please make sure you reach out to any or all of us if you have any questions at all on today or just in general. Sorry, Najib, we've just got a question about getting the slides. They'll be sent out.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think yeah, I think they get emailed out.
Yep, perfect. Well, if that's it from everyone, thank you so much again. Thank you, Owen, Najib, Catherine, everyone who's been involved in pulling today together, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Shari. And just to let everyone know that's still on, the UAE is next month.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Owen.